Hello, my name is Jean-Jacques Nantel. In the last video, we talked about the technological revolutions that allowed mankind to prosper at the expense of its natural environments during the last 2 million years. Among those revolutions, some were very quick to produce results because they had a purely cultural nature. For instance, the agricultural revolution transformed our ancestors into sedentary food producers who could have and feed a lot of children on a very small patch of land. Children that the Industrial Revolution, with all its medical progress, would allow to live until a very old age. In a way, the agricultural revolution produced large surpluses of children, while the Industrial Revolution produced large surpluses of adults and old people. Among the other technological revolutions, some were much slower to produce results because they required important changes of the human body and of its genes. In the last video, we talked about the first tools revolution that required important physical changes. Humans started to stand upright, they lost their body hair, and they had to develop much more powerful brains. Something similar happened during the urban revolution when a lot of people started to live in dirty cities without sewers that were connected to each other by a road network. That setup facilitated the transmission of diseases and forced our ancestors to develop natural immunities against them, which of course took time. To give you an idea how important epidemics have been in the history of mankind, 90% of all the American Indians who died after the discovery of the Americas did so because they had been infected by diseases explorers like Christopher Columbus brought with them without even knowing it. If American diseases didn't kill a lot of Europeans, it is essentially because they had a better immune system. First, their gene pool was much more diversified because they did not descend from a handful of ancestors like the American Indians. Second, they came from the Old World, which produced many more deadly diseases than the much smaller New World. Finally, Europeans had been living for thousands of years with a wide variety of domesticated animals and were regularly infected by their diseases. Such diseases are called zoonoses. It is the collapse of the native population in the three Americas that made possible the European colonization of the continent. As a result, Europe became so rich that it could easily finance its Industrial Revolution, a revolution whose never-ending growth depleted the natural resources of Europe and forced its entrepreneurs to look for more abroad. That quest for new resources and for new markets was what triggered the conquest of the rest of the world. Environmentally speaking, the situation was still tolerable during the colonial times because the vast majority of the dirtiest factories of the world were still concentrated in the Western world and could only destroy a small portion of the planet. The Information Revolution, which also started in the Western world during the 19th century, would change that by allowing people in the South to learn all the Westerners' tricks. Thanks to the telegraph, the telephone, and all the other communication devices that would follow, the Third World copied the Western technologies and started its industrialization, which increased tremendously its consumption, its production, its populations, and especially its pollution. Unfortunately, its cultures were much slower to adapt to the new situation, and sometimes not at all. In fact, many of those cultures didn't reach the 21st century yet. Enormous cultural gaps exist between the living civilizations. Nowadays, we find some Westerners who live and work in space. Billions of Orientals are still living their Industrial Revolution. 500 million Africans are still stuck in their agricultural villages, and some tribes in the most remote parts of the world are still hunting wild animals with bows and arrows. The fact that many cultures in the South are not well adapted to the modern world explains the survival of very old mentalities. For instance, many people in the South still believe that their country will become more powerful if its population keeps growing, without realizing that if they keep doing that, the pollution created by their own industrial revolution will soon make them even more miserable. A good example of that is given by the populations of the Arabian Peninsula, who became so rich and so fast that they could import millions of foreign workers to do all the productive work for them. Being pure parasites, the Saudis, for example, didn't feel the need to change their culture, which even today are still perfectly well adapted to the nomadic lifestyle of their ancestors. The sheikhs who govern those countries are so lazy and ill-prepared that they don't really understand what is going on in the world and sometimes in their own kingdoms. Things are simply happening totally out of their control, and to hide their incompetence, they do as if they were calling the shots. Unfortunately, there are other world leaders who take themselves much more seriously and who believe that if they use enough brutality, they will be able to realize their dream. Mao Zedong, for example, who knew almost nothing about modern technologies, decided to industrialize China in a few years by launching his Great Leap Forward in 1958. He confiscated the land of the Chinese peasants and regrouped them by force in popular communes where they were ordered to produce steel in small furnaces they built themselves in their villages without having any metallurgical expertise. The consequences of such a stupid experiment soon followed. Thousands of tons of totally useless metal were produced, and China experienced a famine that may have killed 45 million people. Rather than admitting his incompetence, Mao launched his Cultural Revolution less than 10 years later, during which the most competent Chinese leaders were systematically persecuted and sometimes killed, which provoked another economic disaster. Another consequence of the backwardness I'm talking about is that the age-old dream of becoming more powerful by increasing a country's population has produced a global population of 7.5 billion people who all want to live the American dream on a dying planet. We can summarize our environmental problem by saying that the Western world started to destroy the planet by inventing the Industrial Revolution, and that the ever-increasing populations in the South are going to finish the job. Fortunately, people, especially when they live near the source of their most pressing problems, tend to adopt the most efficient solutions. When there is a famine, people immediately reduce their sexual activities and therefore their birth rate. When there are no more available agricultural land in a country, peasants tend to move to the nearest cities where they discover an even more acute overpopulation problem, which again encourages them to reduce the size of their families. Since children don't produce wealth in a city, they do on a farm, cities normally behave like the black holes of our astrophysicists. They tend to destroy whatever they attract. The finished goods coming from foreign countries, the energy and the resources coming from the surrounding countryside, and the families who go there only to disappear because they stop having enough kids. If, at the beginning of the 21st century, the Western world has a very low fertility, it is because it is heavily urbanized. If East Asia has a rapidly declining birth rate, it is because its populations are moving to cities in droves. And if the average African family is large, it is because 60% of the Africans are still living in the countryside. When in a country the countryside has been depopulated, migrants tend to come from abroad. It's far from being a good solution, since international migrants face hurdles national migrants don't have to overcome. First, the distance to cover can be very great. And second, it is sometimes necessary to cross deserts, oceans, seas, mountains, and multiple international borders. Third, such a journey can be very expensive. This is the reason why the money necessary normally comes from the destination country, which is rich, rather than from the country of origin, which is poor. In most cases, the money comes from the migrants who are already living in the destination country. The fourth reason why international migrations are difficult is because most countries do everything they can to slow them down, especially when their unemployment rate is high. If migrating to a wealthier country is as natural as breathing, refusing immigration is also something natural. It is so true that borders can be found everywhere in the living kingdom. There is a visible border around every single living cell, the cellular membrane. There is a border around every individual, the skin. There is a border around every family house, around every nation, and even around every civilization. Everywhere, borders are used to protect the wealth accumulated by an individual or by a group. This is true for all bacteria, plants, animals, and humans. It is to produce as much wealth as possible with as few conflicts as possible that nations normally try to become more homogeneous with the passing of time, with only one government, one law, one religion, one language, etc. This is the fundamental reason why mass immigration is always very costly for a nation. Even if almost everybody admits that immigrants, when they are in a limited number, are often very useful. Since it is difficult, costly, and very slow to move tens of millions of poor people across seas and across continents, and since the rich nations cannot and don't want to accept them, the billions of people who live in the overcrowded cities in the developing world are forced to alleviate the problem themselves by having less and less children. During the last 30 years, their fertility rates have collapsed at such an amazing pace that in some cases they are now below the European rates. The phenomenon is so obvious and has so much momentum that without a doubt those rates will keep declining for many years to come. What people really try to do in the developing world without realizing it is that they try to compensate the decline of their natural environment with the decline of their family size. The trend is very clear. Very soon, within some decades, all the nations on the planet will have a declining population. The decline I'm talking about is very obvious in the Islamic world, despite the fact that its religious and political leaders are in favor of large families. Mass urbanization is the culprit here, mainly because working parents in those traditionalist societies use the school system as a sort of permanent kindergarten for their teenagers, boys and girls. The fact that Muslim girls are now educated is what really triggered that silent revolution, since it is well known that the best way to change a society is by empowering women. Modern women in the Islamic world are now literate enough to know how to reduce artificially the number of their children, and they do that without consulting anybody. The internet and the other communication system invented in the Western world only accelerate that sort of cultural revolution by making it much easier to move knowledge rather than people. Nowadays, poor people in the developing world no longer have to move in faraway countries to become rich. They can stay home, copy the Western technologies with the communication systems, and build their own businesses and factories in their homeland. Here again, the trend is very clear. In the future, especially when the birth rates will be similar all over the world, people will tend to stay home to work and mass immigration will almost disappear. It already happened since 2009 along the border between USA and Mexico, where as many Mexicans are leaving USA than those who are entering in USA. Unfortunately, the idea to produce wealth in our former third world has one major flaw. It's too efficient. The planet, which was already sick when it had to support less than 1 billion rich people, will clearly be unable during the next decades to absorb all the pollution produced by billions upon billions of new rich consumers. The simple fact that our natural environments are collapsing at an ever-increasing pace means that every one of the 10 billion people who will live on this planet at the end of the 21st century will need an ever-increasing agricultural land only to feed himself. There is no way out. Even the collapse of the birth rates in the South will be insufficient to re-establish a viable equilibrium between mankind and its natural environments. There are simply too many living people on this planet, and our total population will have to diminish a lot. In fact, what we are destroying today will probably determine the number of our descendants for centuries to come. Since every single politician keep talking about economic growth, and since almost everybody wants to consume more, not less, the population collapse I'm talking about will have to be involuntary. Most probably it will be caused by a total loss of control over our destiny. The acceleration of history, which is very real, will play a major role here, since most people are already overwhelmed by it. Psychologically, we are still prehistoric animals who are made to cope with the very slow pace of change found in the forests where our ancestors lived for hundreds of millions of years. These days, the technologies and the scientific theories are changing so fast that even experts struggle to keep up to date. The news and our emails travel at the speed of light, and any nuclear device could destroy in a few seconds New York, Wall Street, and therefore a significant part of the world economy. In the future, our aging population will only add to the problem, since most people develop their mentality and their opinions when they are teenagers, only to refuse afterwards to change them until the end of their lives. When you refuse to use your intelligence to solve obvious and urgent problems, you are condemned to be ruled by the toughest laws of biology. This is why the law of natural selection, that destroyed so many species since the invention of agriculture 10 or 12,000 years ago, will now play an ever-increasing role in our destiny. All over the world, those who will fare better during the coming environmental crisis will be the most useful professionals, the richest, the youngest, the healthiest, the most beautiful women, because they will marry rich people, etc. In that selection process, the poor, the sick, the old, and all the other underprivileged people will be more or less abandoned by our bankrupt governments. At the international level, the food exporting countries should lose much less people than the most polluted, overpopulated, and landlocked countries. It is even probable that the food exporting countries will start using less and less fertilizers and pesticides in order to save as much agricultural land as possible, which will decrease their production and their exports and create important food shortages in the rest of the world. I remind you that in 2013 the United Nations reported that mankind had food reserves for only about 74 days, which means that to feed ourselves we all depend on an annual food production that could easily be disrupted by a major war or by a large-scale natural disaster. This is what happens in the poor countries that are regularly ravaged by droughts, flooding, or epidemics. In the future, when pollution will have poisoned most of our agricultural land, mankind will be so malnourished that our global population will diminish rapidly. That demographic collapse will have three main causes. First, the decline of our birth rates will play a major role. Second, old people will be so weak that diseases like malaria, tuberculosis, or the flu will kill them at an ever younger age. Since those people will die at home or in the hospital, that part of the demographic collapse will be very real and important, but not very spectacular. Third, many adults will be killed by all the natural and man-made disasters I will describe in the next videos of this series. I totally agree with you that we don't need all those problems, but since nobody wants to do anything significant about it, the demographic decline I just described will happen. Anyway, we just don't have the technologies that would allow us to repair all the damages done to the natural environments that keep us alive. The decline of our species will then continue until we reach the moment when the few surviving natural environments will again be able to absorb our pollution. What I just described is not very original. This is precisely what happened during the famines of our not so distant past. Mankind will not disappear. It will adapt to the situation. We will pass through the bottleneck which is in front of us. We will lose a lot of people before restarting, much more modestly, with the millions of kids the best adapted people will have produced. The only good news in it is that those kids will be better than us. They will be healthier, wiser, they will have more efficient bodies, etc. This is precisely what happens when the natural selection adapts a species after the destruction of its natural habitat. Something important, those who will survive the crisis will not be those that most people would expect. There will be many surprises. Will the crisis be short? Impossible. Not for humans anyway. We destroyed so much that nature will need centuries, and if not millennia, to repair everything. After that, a new world and a new era will begin, and there is every reason to believe that it will be very interesting. We will talk about it later. As usual, I thank you in advance to recommend this video to your friend and family. See you next time.